I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that is the plain version without drama. My wife, June, had been gone 4 months, and I had become the kind of man who measured a day by tasks he could finish with his hands. I worked nights at the county library because nights were quiet and practical and full of work no one thanked you for. Returns desk first, then mopping, then the boiler room check before closing. I shelved books with the same rhythm I used to stack hay bales: spine out, level, square. If I kept moving, I could pretend I was holding shape. If I stood still too long, grief came in through the ribs like cold air under a door. Home didn't help. The farmhouse sat 12 minutes from town, down a road with 2 washed-out shoulders and 1 mailbox that leaned harder every season. June's coat still hung by the mudroom door because I couldn't decide whether moving it was practical or betrayal. Her boots were under the bench, toes dusted with dry field dirt from the last day she wore them. I left both where they were and stepped around them like they were marked evidence at a work site. The kitchen clock kept time too loud. The refrigerator hummed too loud. Even the old floorboards sounded offended when I crossed the hall after midnight. I'd come in from shift, rinse out my coffee thermos, and sit at the table with the radio off, because voices from strangers felt worse than silence. I slept in patches and called it rest. Folks who knew me even a little would have told you I was not built for mystery. I did mechanical maintenance for 27 years at the paper mill before layoffs sliced through the county. I trust things that can be tightened, cleaned, replaced, or explained. Bearings fail for reasons. Pipes knock for reasons. Wind sounds one way in poplar and another in cedar, and if you've lived long enough in one valley, you can tell them apart in the dark. I never had patience for stories about lights in ridges or shadows walking where no roads run. Old-timer talk filled diner stools and gave men something to do between weather and football. That was my view, fixed and sturdy. Grief didn't make me softer, it made me narrower. My son, Caleb, called once every 10 days in that period, and we spoke like 2 men balancing ladders on uneven ground. He lived 3 states away, worked logistics at a warehouse complex, and kept odd shifts of his own. We'd always loved each other better than we talked to each other. After June died, that gap got wider. One Thursday near the end of September, I answered on the second ring because I was already awake and pretending to read invoices at the kitchen table. "You eating real food?" he asked. "I'm eating." That's not what I asked. I had eggs. Today, I looked at the sink at 1 fork and 1 plate. This week. He let out a breath through his nose the way his mother used to when she was trying not to push too hard. "Dad, I can come down for a weekend. You've got your own life. You are my life too." I didn't answer quick enough, and the silence did what silence does. He changed the subject to truck tires and overtime, and I let him. When we hung up, I sat there staring at the dark window over the sink until my coffee went flat and cold. The library took me in because county budgets run on luck, desperation, and whoever can keep old systems alive without calling a contractor. I handled returns and basement maintenance, and on paper that sounded like 2 jobs. In practice, it was one long chore done in different temperatures. Upstairs smelled like paper glue and floor wax. Downstairs smelled like steam and dust and the faint metallic breath of old pipes. The building itself was a split level from the 70s, wide eaves, low windows, and carpet that remembered every wet boot from November through March. By the first week of October, I knew which fluorescent tubes flickered before they died, and which carts pulled left because their casters were bent. I liked knowing that. Knowledge you can use at 2 in the morning is a mercy. Miss Ada Pike still came every Tuesday, even after retirement, and she moved through that place like she had her own weather. She was small, wiry, white-haired, always carrying a canvas tote that seemed too heavy for her frame and never too heavy for her hands. Officially, she was done with the children's room. Unofficially, she still sorted donated chapter books, patched torn jackets with clear tape, and corrected the way we stacked beginner readers, because a child shouldn't have to hunt for comfort. Everyone called her Miss Ada, including people old enough to be her classmates. I did too. She called me Earl, like she'd known me forever, even though we'd only worked together a couple of years. The first Tuesday, I noticed her routine. I was outside behind the loading dock, trying to clear maple leaves from a clogged drain with a length of bent rebar. The afternoon had that thin cold that gets into your wrists. Miss Ada came out carrying a folding chair under one arm and a hardback under the other, walked past the dumpsters, crossed the edge of the lot, and set herself at the cedar line as neat as if she were taking attendance. No one else was there. No parents, no kids, no school bus dropping late riders from the rural route. Just Miss Ada, a chair, and 40 minutes of steady reading aimed at the trees. I asked about it the next day while I was wheeling returns to shelving. "You got a new outreach program I missed?" She didn't look up from the cart she was organizing. Not new, just smaller. There wasn't anyone out there. There used to be 6 regulars from Bramble Road and the 2 brothers from Hollow Creek. District cut those bus runs. Their mamas can't make pickup every week, so I go anyway. To read to cedar trunks? She turned then, gave me that calm librarian stare that could quiet a room full of second graders. To read where they can still find me, if they ever can. Her mouth softened a little. And because stories don't mind if the audience is late. I had no good answer for that. I nodded like I understood and pushed my cart on. I began arranging my Tuesday work so I could be behind the building around the same time. I told myself I was checking drains, checking fence line, checking whether the back security light had a loose connection. Mostly I sat on an old stump with a screwdriver and a rusted toolbox beside me, pretending to fix a hinge that did not need fixing. Boone came with me when he could. He was an old red-bone hound with grey around the muzzle and one ear that never stood right after a barbed wire scrape years back. Boone had become my second shadow after June died, padding from room to room as if he was counting me. He didn't like thunder, didn't like delivery trucks, didn't like anything that moved too fast in the edge of his sight. Around Miss Ada's Tuesday readings, though, he'd settle down with a grunt, chin on paws, eyes half closed, listening. There was a particular way her voice carried in that strip of trees. Not loud, not performative, just clear and patient, each sentence placed where it belonged. She read adventure books, horse books, stories about kids who found courage one chore at a time. Sometimes she did character voices and laughed at herself after, a quick laugh that sounded surprised to still be alive. I sat far enough off not to intrude and close enough to hear words drift through cedar and alder. Those 40 minutes were the only stretch of my week when my chest loosened and I stopped bracing for the next hard thing. I did not call it comfort then. I called it routine. Practical men rename tenderness so they can keep it. One Tuesday near dusk, she finished a chapter and closed the book against her thumb, then looked over toward me like she'd known exactly where I was the whole time. "You can come sit proper, Earl," she called. "No one's grading your attendance." "I'm working," I said, lifting the useless screwdriver for proof. "On that same hinge for 3 weeks?" I walked over anyway, because she was right and because pretending had gotten tiring. Boone rose, stretched, and followed. Up close, the cedar needles gave off a clean, sharp smell, and the ground was springy with old duff. Miss Ada patted a milk crate beside her chair. "Sit, I'm starting chapter 6. "What book?" "Old Yeller." I made a face without meaning to. "That one's rough." It's honest, she said, then quieter. Honest can help. I sat. Boone dropped at my boots. She read and I listened, and for the length of that chapter, I wasn't a widower avoiding his own house. I was just a man hearing a story in the fading light, breathing at the same pace as the pages turning. Afterward she packed her book, stood with a small wince in her knees, and brushed cedar bits from her skirt. You should take a turn next week, she said. Not my lane. You worked in a mill 3 decades and raised a boy. You can read 2 pages. I'd clear the room. She gave me that look again, direct and kind at once. There isn't a room, Earl. That's the point. She walked toward the lot, folding chair under her arm, Boone trailing her halfway like an escort before circling back to me. I stayed by the tree line until dark came down, and the security light buzzed on over the back door. For the first time in months, I drove home without turning the radio up to fill space. That night, I stood in the mudroom with June's coat in front of me and put my hand on the sleeve, instead of flinching past it. The fabric was cool and still held a faint trace of cedar soap she liked. I did not move it. I did not put it away. I just stood there long enough to feel what I felt and call it by its name. Loss, yes, love too. Both true at once. By the time I reached the kitchen, Boone had already circled twice on his rug and settled with a sigh. I warmed leftover stew, ate at the table and wrote Tuesday on a scrap envelope I kept by the phone, then underlined it once. I told myself it was to remember a schedule change. I knew better. It was because 1 hour in the woods behind a county library had become the only place I could sit inside my own life without feeling like it had ended. I left that envelope by the phone and stood there a minute longer with the kitchen light buzzing over me, one hand on the chair back, listening to Boone breathe from his rug like he was keeping watch through the night shift I hadn't started yet. The house had that hollow sound it gets after 10 o'clock, when every room feels farther from the next one than it did during daylight. I washed my bowl, set it in the drainer, and wiped the counter twice, though it was already clean. Then I checked the back door latch, checked it again, and told myself that was habit, not nerves. Sleep didn't come in one stretch anymore. It came in narrow pieces like boards cut short for a job that needed full length. I lay there, hearing rain start and stop on the metal porch roof, hearing Boone shift once, hearing the windows around the eaves. Around 3, I gave up, pulled on jeans and my canvas jacket, and stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight I never switched on. Cloud cover had swallowed the moon. The yard was just shapes and darker shapes. Fence posts and the bent outline of the old clothesline June had always meant to replace. Boone came out behind me, shook once, then stood hip to my knee as if we were both waiting for instructions from someone who wasn't there. I walked to the lower field by feel, boots finding ruts I could have mapped blind. The grass was wet enough to soak my cuffs. At the fence break, I stopped and looked toward the cottonwoods along Mill Creek. In daylight, that stretch was ordinary as dishwater. At night, it felt like the edge of a question. I wasn't scared of it. I was tired of it. Tired of all the spaces where I used to turn and say, "You seeing this?" and get an answer from the person beside me. You build a life around shared noticing, and after loss, the whole world keeps presenting things with nowhere to put them. I leaned on the top wire and spoke low because saying words out loud was easier than letting them spin in my skull. "I'm doing what I can, June." Boone flicked an ear but didn't move. "I'm getting to work. I'm feeding the dog. I paid the propane bill on time for once." My throat tightened at that, a laugh catching wrong. That should earn me a ribbon from somebody. The laugh died fast. I rubbed my eyes with thumb and forefinger until stars flashed in the dark. I don't know what counts anymore. That's the truth. By the middle of October, cold had started settling into the hollows before dawn, and breath showed white in the barn light by 4 in the morning. I took to walking the perimeter of the property before late shifts, not because anything was wrong with fence or gate, just because movement burned off the worst of the ache. Boone trotted ahead, stopped every so often to sniff deer tracks and old leaves, then circled back to bump my hand with his shoulder. He didn't ask me to be cheerful. He asked me to keep moving. There are days that is more than enough. On Sunday afternoon, with 2 days until Tuesday, I drove to the library early even though my shift didn't start until dusk. The lot was empty except for staff cars and a county pickup with one taillight out. Wind had come up hard from the west. It pushed wrappers along the curb, shook rain out of the maples, and made the flag by the loading dock crack like a snapped belt. I grabbed gloves and a rake and went behind the building to clear the drainage swale before leaves packed it solid. Cedar needles stuck to my sleeves. The ground gave under my boots where old roots made mounds. I worked until my shoulders burned, then sat on the stump where I'd been pretending to fix that hinge and let the rake rest across my knees. No one was out there, no readers, no Miss Ada, no reason to stay except I didn't want to go inside yet. The cedar line stood dark and close, trunks rising straight, lower boughs netted together so thick a rabbit had to find tunnels to pass through. A few jays bickered high up. Somewhere deeper in, a woodpecker tapped in an even rhythm that sounded like someone patient at a locked door. I tried to pray and found I had forgotten the shape of it. Not the words from church. Those were still in muscle memory. I mean the plain kind, where you say what hurts without arranging it into respectable sentences. So I sat there with my gloves in my lap and admitted what I had been avoiding all month. I was angry at June for leaving, angry at myself for being angry, angry at every person who said time, like time was a wrench that could tighten grief back into place. A crow landed on the chain-link fence, watched me one hard second and flew off. Boone, who had been nosing ferns, came back and set his chin on my boot. I scratched behind his ear and said, "We're a real pair, buddy." He thumped his tail once, as if to agree that, yes, standards had slipped. Inside, fluorescent lights and book carts brought my pulse down to working range. Normal tasks help because they are indifferent to your feelings. Returns came in damp from people reading in bathtubs and on covered porches. I scanned barcodes sorted by section, wiped mud off one atlas with a rag from maintenance. At 7, Miss Ada appeared beside the desk carrying her tote and a stack of repaired paperbacks. She wore a maroon cardigan and a knitted hat with a tiny tear by the seam. "You look peaked," she said. "I looked that way before, you just noticed." She made a small noise that could have been approval. "Tuesday's coming. Bring a better voice than that." "I didn't know I'd been drafted." "You were drafted the day you sat down on that crate." She slid the books toward me and lowered her tone. "Silence can be medicine, Earl. So can reading through it." I nodded because arguing would have wasted both our time. Tuesday came in with gusts strong enough to shove shopping carts sideways. By noon, the sky had gone the colour of old pewter. I spent the first half of shift in the boiler room replacing a stubborn valve gasket, then hauled 2 trash bins to the rear enclosure and heard Miss Ada's folding chair clink against the concrete as she carried it past me. "Still reading in this?" I asked, nodding at the wind. "Children rode horses to school in weather worse than this," she said. "We can manage chapter 7. You ever take a day off?" "Only for funerals and pneumonia." She squinted up at me. "You joining?" I glanced at the flag, snapping hard enough to blur. "I'll be nearby." She set up at the cedar edge, opened Old Yeller, and began. The first 3 minutes were ordinary storm noise, tarp corners slapping at the maintenance shed, leaves skittering across asphalt, branches rattling against each other in dry clicks. Then, in the space between one sentence and the next, the strip of woods directly behind her went quiet, in a way I felt in my jaw before I understood it. The outer trees still swayed. The flag still cracked, but the 100-foot band of cedar and fir at her back held steady as if someone had cupped a hand over that one portion of the world and turned the volume down. I stood there holding a half-full trash bag like an idiot and waited for the trick to break. It didn't. Miss Ada kept reading, calm as kitchen light. Boone, who usually paced when wind gusted, walked to the edge of the clearing, circled once, and lay down facing the trees. Not tense, not crouched, just settled, tail tapping earth in a slow metronome. His ears stayed up, but his body loosened the way it did when June used to sing while kneading bread. I watched him more than the trees, because I trusted his instincts better than my own moods. I told myself topography could do strange things with wind. I told myself the cedar wall blocked gusts and made a pocket. I told myself not every odd pattern needed a story pinned to it. Then Miss Ada closed the book on chapter break and, almost on cue, the stillness released. Branches shivered, needle clusters hissed. Somewhere above, 2 crows resumed arguing like they had been waiting for permission. Boone rose, stretched long through his back legs, and trotted to me with a look that said we had just witnessed something he considered perfectly reasonable. "Tea break," Miss Ada said, standing carefully. I brought a thermos. I walked over and took the cup she offered. "You noticed that? The wind? The lack of it?" She studied the cedar line, then shrugged one shoulder. "I notice many things. I don't always label them right away." She took her cup back. "What did you notice?" That Boone didn't care. She smiled into the steam. Boone has good taste. When she packed up, I stayed behind to latch the back gate and check the drainage grate one more time. Light was going fast, clouds turning from grey to that bruised purple evening gets before full dark. At the edge of the ferns where her chair had been, something pale caught my eye. I knelt and brushed aside wet needles. 2 smooth river stones lay crossed in a clean X atop a rectangle of bark, scrubbed free of dirt. Not random spill, not kicked up by mower, not washed in from anywhere near this dry patch. Deliberately placed, centered where her boots had been. I picked one up, cool, heavy, worn flat by years of current. The other had a white stripe running diagonally like chalk. Boone came close, sniffed the bark once, then sat. No hackles, no whine, no restless pawing. He looked from the stones to the trees and back to me with patient eyes. If I'd found that arrangement anywhere else, I might have called it kids fooling around. But there were no shoe prints in the soft ground besides ours. No bike tracks, no candy wrappers, no sign of bored teenagers making art behind a public building on a storm day. I set the stones back exactly as I'd found them and stood slowly, knees protesting. For a second, I had the odd sensation of being expected to do something polite, like nod toward a neighbor who had helped stack hay without asking. So I did. I looked at the cedar line and tipped my chin once before I could talk myself out of it. "All right then," I said under my breath. Boone thumped his tail against the fern mat. I locked up the back entrance, carried the trash to the bin, and finished shift on schedule. But my focus kept slipping sideways to that little X of Riverstone and the hush that had wrapped the trees while Ada read. On my meal break, I drew a rough sketch on receipt paper of where the stones sat, relative to the stump, chair spot, and fence post, then folded it into my wallet, because writing things down felt steadier than wondering. By closing time, the wind had dropped some, and mist had started threading through the parking lot lights. I walked Boone one last loop behind the building before heading home. The stones were still there, untouched, pale in the dim like 2 marks on a map. I hadn't learned to read yet. I stood there longer than I meant to, with Boone nosing at damp fern stems and the parking lot lights buzzing behind us, trying to decide whether 2 crossed stones were worth changing the shape of my week. Practical answer was no. Practical answer was lock up, drive home, feed the dog, sleep what sleep I could, and show up tomorrow to do the next thing. But I had already drawn a map on receipt paper like a man marking a fault line, and that told me plain enough I was past pretending not to care. On the drive home, mist hung low over Hollow Creek Road and turned every oncoming headlight into a white blur that opened and shut around me. Boone rode with his chin on the seat edge, ears twitching at each pothole. At the farmhouse I fed him, reheated coffee I should have dumped, and spread my wallet contents on the kitchen table under the one good bulb. Store receipts, a parts list for boiler gaskets, Caleb's last phone number scribble in June's handwriting from years back, and my little map with X marks and fence lines. I added one more note in the margin. Stones unchanged at 10:42 p.m. I slept in 2 short pieces. In the gap between them, I lay staring at the ceiling and ran through explanations the way I used to run troubleshooting trees at the mill. Kid prank. Retired scoutmaster with a craft habit. Miss Ada doing her own version of ceremony. Wind pocket and coincidence stacked together. Each one sounded tidy until I held it against what I had actually seen. Storm everywhere, but stillness in that one strip of woods while she read. Then release when she closed the book, as repeatable as a valve, opening and closing on command. I rolled over, pulled the blanket up, and muttered into the dark, "You're tired, that's all." Boone thumped once from his rug as if he had notes on my diagnosis. By Thursday evening, I had talked myself almost back into normal, right up until I stepped behind the library, with a coil of old baling twine, meant for tying Ada's book crate handles. She had left the crate under the back awning while she sorted donations inside. One handle had frayed through the week before, and I'd promised a temporary fix until I could bolt on new rope grips. I set the twine down, went to fetch pliers from maintenance, and got delayed by a leaking faucet in staff restroom. 20 minutes, maybe 25. When I came back, both crate handles were neatly wrapped and reinforced in a sailor-clean splice I had not done, and could not improve if I tried. The knot sat centered, tight, and dry despite the drizzle blowing under the awning. I carried the crate into her and set it on the work table. "You tie these?" She glanced down over her readers and smiled a little. "I was about to ask if you did." "Wasn't me." "Well," she said, touching one knot with a finger, "whoever did has better hands than both of us." I kept my voice neutral. "Anyone else have access out back this afternoon?" Grounds crew came through at noon and left in a hurry. Storm warning. She studied me, patient as always. "You look like you're building a case file." "Maybe I am." "Against what?" "That's the trouble." I lifted one shoulder. "I don't know yet." She nodded like that made sense. "Then notice first. Decide later." That phrase stayed with me. Notice first. Decide later. It sounded like librarian advice. It also sounded like grief advice no one had managed to give me straight. By the 3rd Tuesday of October, I started arriving an hour early on purpose, before my shift clock, before anyone could ask why I was standing by cedar trunks with a notepad like a county intern. I carried a pocket wind gauge from my mill days, and felt foolish enough about it that I kept it in my jacket until I was alone. Boone came each time, moving slower in the hips but stubborn about routine. We'd make one loop from fence post to drainage grate to stump and back, and I'd write down whatever looked off. Fresh bark strip laid flat near Ada's chair spot. 3 late blackberries fanned on clean cedar bark, 1 dry bundle of kindling in a place that had been wet all morning. Not piled sloppy, arranged, offered. The first time I found the blackberry fan, I actually laughed once under my breath, sharp and embarrassed at myself. I said, "Great, Earl, you're being courted by landscaping." And Boone looked up like he was deciding whether to leave me to my decline. Humour helped for about 10 seconds. Then I saw the berries were unwilted, no grit on them, and the bark underneath had been rubbed smooth of dirt and needles, as if whoever placed them understood you set food on something clean. I put the bark and berries in a gallon freezer bag from maintenance, labelled it with date and time, and stored it in the staff fridge behind 2 yogurts and a half jar of pickles, because I had crossed into evidence collecting, and there was no graceful retreat from that. The next morning, the berries were still there, and no one in staff had touched them. I took them home after shift and set them on the porch rail. A jay landed, eyed me, and carried one off. Boone sniffed the bark and lay down beside it like a guard. 2 days later, when wind came up hard again, the same still band formed behind Ada while she read Chapter 8. Outside it, maple leaves spun and fence wire sang. Inside it, cedar boughs held steady. Boone settled at the edge with his paws crossed and watched the tree line with that calm focus old hounds get when they trust what they smell. I checked the gauge twice, then a third time because I did not trust the number. 12 to 14-mile gusts by the dock, near 0 in the reading patch while her voice carried. She finished the chapter, closed the book, and the needles hissed all at once like someone had pulled cotton from my ears. I sat on the milk crate beside her that day instead of hiding on the stump. She poured tea from her thermos into the lid cup and handed it over. "You're pale," she said. "I'm measuring wind now." She gave me a side glance. "That sounds healthy." "I'm serious." "I know." She tucked a bookmark into Old Yeller and looked toward the trees. "What are you hoping to prove? That I'm not inventing this?" "Earl," she said softly, "there are many true things that don't turn into tidy proofs." I stared into the tea steam. "I'm not built for untidy." "No," she said, and patted my forearm once, light as turning a page. "But you're learning." That evening at home, I pulled June's old canning notebook from the drawer where we kept takeout menus and wrote a fresh page title. Backlot Observations. Date, weather, wind, gift objects, Boone behaviour. I knew how that looked. I could hear Caleb teasing me gently for going full detective at age 58. But for 40 minutes each Tuesday, my grief loosened enough for curiosity to breathe. And curiosity was the first thing besides duty that had felt alive in me for months. I wasn't about to shut it down. The first full glimpse came 3 mornings later, and if I had not been there myself, I would have argued with the man telling it. Rain had run all night, steady and cold. Not a downpour yet, but enough to swell the drainage culvert behind the library into brown, fast water that carried twigs and leaves in spinning clumps. I got there before dawn to clear debris before shift, headlights cutting through mist so thick the far fence looked painted on air. Boone jumped down slow, shook off, and followed me with that stiff-legged determination old dogs use when they are not letting you go alone. The ground behind the cedar line was slick and dark, mud over roots, fern tops bowed underwater. I crouched by the culvert grate with a hook pole and worked out a jam of branches while my breath smoked in front of me. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a deer stepped, and then another, soft hoof sounds. No snorting alarm. Crows were present. I could see 2 shapes high on a dead snag. But they were quiet, not mobbing, not giving those harsh warning calls they use for coyotes or strangers. I stood up, wiped rain from my face, and turned toward the reading path to check whether the small wooden signpost had survived the night gusts. It hadn't. It lay angled in the mud, one stake half pulled loose, arrow board pointing at nothing. I swore once under my breath and started toward it. That was when movement crossed between two fir trunks uphill of the path, broad and dark, and far larger than any man in a coat could account for. It didn't burst out, didn't crash brush. It moved with deliberate care, placing each step in open ground, lifting over windfall instead of snapping through. Mist drifted across it in thin bands. I could make out shoulder width first, then the long slope of back, then one arm reaching forward with a hand so large, the signpost board looked like a toy slat when it grasped it. I froze where I was, hook pole hanging useless at my side, rain ticking on my jacket. My heart kicked hard, but not from the kind of fear that empties you. It was the shock of scale, of seeing something I had filed under stories occupy real space in wet morning light. Boone stood beside me, head high, ears forward. He did not bark, he did not tuck his tail. He watched. The figure set the signpost upright with slow precision, pressed mud around the base with the side of its hand, then adjusted the arrow until it faced the reading patch exactly. Not approximate. Exact. It leaned back a fraction as if checking alignment, then stepped away and paused when Boone shifted his weight. For 3 long breaths we all stayed still. Rain threading down, culvert water running fast below us. The figure turned just enough that I saw part of its face through mist. Dark fur matted with drizzle, brow heavy, and eyes amber-brown in that dim light, steady and attentive. No bearing, no charge posture, no threat in it. Just watchfulness, like a neighbor making sure the gate latched before heading home. I heard myself whisper, "Thank you," before I decided to speak. At that, it lowered its head once. Small movement, almost a nod, then moved back between fir trunks and was gone in the same, careful, unhurried way it had appeared. Branches swayed after, but there was no dramatic crash, no sprinting noise, nothing theatrical. Just a large being choosing quiet. I stood there with rain on my face and mud up my boots, trying to fit what I had seen into language that wouldn't break under its own weight. Present tense took over in my head, clear and blunt. I know what a bear looks like. I know what a man looks like. I know distance and proportion. I'm not guessing. I'm standing in this wet clearing with Boone breathing beside me, and something enormous just repaired a sign so children can find a reading chair. Boone walked to the replanted signpost, sniffed the base, then sat beside it like a sentry. I went over and put my hand on the wood. Firm, straight, packed tight, better than the county crew's original job. In the mud near the stake were impressions where weight had settled, wider than my spread hand, deep but controlled, edges clean from a careful step rather than a slide. Behind me the culvert ran clearer where I had pulled the jam. Ahead of me the sign pointed true toward the cedars. The dawn was still grey, the day still ordinary in every other way. And yet I knew with a certainty that sat low and solid in my chest that I had crossed from speculation into witness. I stayed with my hand on that signpost until my fingers went numb from the rain, as if pressure could confirm what my eyes already had. Boone rose from his sit, shook water from his coat, and looked uphill again. I followed his line of sight. Nothing moved between the fir trunks now, only mist sliding through branches and the grey half-light turning every wet surface to dull silver. The morning smelled of cedar pitch, mud, and cold creek water. My hook pole felt too small for my grip, like a tool from the wrong job. I walked back to the culvert and kept working because the water still needed clearing. Habit did that for me when my mind lagged behind. I pulled one branch jam, then another, and each time I straightened up, I checked the trees. At first it was quick glances, guilty almost, like I expected someone from town to step out and laugh at me for jumping at fog. Then Boone padded 10 feet uphill and stopped. Not rigid, not warning, just attentive. And I looked longer. A broad shape stood between two cedar trunks where the ground rose, still enough to blend until my eyes found the outline. It wasn't hidden exactly. It just wasn't forcing itself forward. Rain beaded on dark fur. One arm rested low at its side, hand open. The distance might have been 40 yards, maybe a little more. Enough that I could have turned away and pretended I hadn't seen it a second time. I did not turn away. Present tense took me again, clean and blunt. I am here. Boone is calm. That sign is standing because of him. I can leave right now and keep my old life arranged the same way, with every unknown shoved into a corner marked nonsense. Or I can stand in this wet morning and accept that the world has always had rooms I never entered. My heartbeat was loud, but it wasn't panic. It felt like the moment before speaking at a funeral when the truth has to come out plain. Or not at all. I set the hook pole down on the mud where he could see both my hands empty. "Morning," I said, voice rough from weather and nerves. "I'm Earl." Saying my own name out there felt strange, formal, like introducing myself to the county line. Boone glanced back at me, then returned his attention uphill. The figure tilted his head a fraction. Not confusion, more like acknowledgement. He shifted one step to the side, careful of a rotted log underfoot, then crouched with a slow bend that made his size harder to grasp. He lifted a broken limb from the reading path and carried it 3 paces off before setting it beside a stump with deliberate placement, parallel to 2 other downed limbs, as neat as stacked cordwood. No rush, no display, just work. I found myself nodding as if we were 2 maintenance men meeting on a Tuesday repair. "Yeah," I said quietly. That was in the way. Humour hit me from nowhere, dry and small, but real. I've been outworked by somebody with no time card. Boone's tail gave one soft thump against wet fern. We stayed in that arrangement for maybe a minute, maybe 5. Time got loose at the edges. He watched me clear the last of the culvert grate. I watched him stand back from the path he'd tidied and scan the tree line in a slow arc, watchful the way a rancher checks fence after wind. When I tugged the final branch free, water ran clean through the concrete throat and the level dropped an inch right before my eyes. I looked up to share that automatic little satisfaction working people know, and he was already stepping deeper into cedars. Not fleeing, just leaving room. 2 strides and he was shadow. Another, and he was gone. By the time staff started arriving, rain had eased to a fine needle mist. I marked mud impressions by the signpost with orange survey flags from maintenance, so grounds crew wouldn't trample them before I made notes. Then I pulled the flags back out. I didn't want a crowd behind the library with tape measures and loud theories. I wrote dimensions in June's canning notebook instead and kept the page folded, length against my boot, depth at heel, stride spacing. Enough detail that I couldn't later accuse myself of exaggeration. Miss Ada came through the back door with her tote under a clear poncho and stopped when she saw my face. "You saw him," she said, no rise in her voice, as if she were saying I'd finally fixed the copier. I leaned one shoulder against the wall and let rain drip off my cap brim. "You knew it was a him." "I suspected." She set down her tote and studied the path. "Did he frighten you?" "No." I took a breath and corrected myself. "He startled me so hard I forgot my own birthday." "But no, not fear." She nodded once, satisfied. "And Boone?" "Calmest I've seen him in years." "Then trust the dog." She pulled a hand towel from her tote and offered it. "Tell me what happened, slow." I told her. Not everything at once, just the facts in order. Signpost down, shape in mist, hand on the board, careful placement. The second sighting uphill. Broken limb moved from the path. She listened without interrupting, one hand on the crate handle that had been neatly spliced by unknown hands. When I finished, she looked toward the cedars for a long moment. Some presences, she said, don't want to be chased. They want to be recognized. That sounds like librarian poetry. It's retired librarian poetry, she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. Worse, technically. I laughed, brief and surprised, and felt my shoulders drop for the first time all morning. Wonder came in there not like lightning, more like warmth finding circulation in a hand gone cold. Disbelief had kept me upright for months by narrowing the world to what I could measure. Standing in that drizzle, listening to Ada talk as if we were discussing bird habits, I felt the edges of that narrow world ease open. Tuesday afternoon, the wind came hard again, and I took the milk crate beside Ada without being asked. Boone settled at my boots, facing the trees. She read chapter 9, voice steady, and the same band of woods held still behind her, while maple branches beyond the lot whipped and hissed. I didn't check the gauge this time. I watched the line where moving air met quiet cedar and let myself feel astonishment without trying to dismantle it. At the chapter break, Ada sipped tea and nudged the book toward me. Your turn. 2 pages. I'll butcher the voices. Then butcher them kindly. I read. My voice cracked on the first paragraph and smoothed by the second. Somewhere in the middle, Boone lifted his head and looked to the left edge of the cedar wall, ears up, body loose. I followed his gaze and saw only shadow and trunk spacing, but the sensation of being listened to settled over the clearing. Not heavy, just present. When I finished my 2 pages, the stillness held 1 beat longer, then released as Ada closed the cover. That evening, after we stacked chairs and locked the rear gate, she touched my sleeve. You're less alone than you were. I looked past her to the path sign now standing straight in its packed mud collar. Yeah, I said. I think that's true. Rain returned 3 days later and stayed, a long, soaking weather front that turned the lot edges to slick clay and made every doorway smell of wet wool and old books. On Friday, I brought one of June's hardbacks from home, a worn copy of Old Yeller with her pencil marks in the margins, from when Caleb was 10 and insisted on hearing it twice a week. I kept it in my truck under the bench seat inside a locking storage tray because I wasn't ready for anyone's hands on it yet, not even mine for long. I only wanted it close, the way some men carry a photo in a wallet they rarely open. Near closing, Miss Ada called down from children's stacks. Earl, if you're heading out back, check my tarp ties on the crate, would you? This rain's finding every gap. I did the rounds, cinched the tarp corners, tested the knots. Boone waited by the loading dock door with that patient old man posture he had when his hips ached. We finished late. Staff left in 2s under umbrellas. I killed rear lights, locked the service entrance, and stood for a moment under the awning, listening to rain drum on metal. The cedar line was a dark wall beyond the lot, and somewhere inside it a single branch knocked gently in rhythm. I don't know what made me check the truck before getting in. Habit, maybe. Maybe that same felt nudge that had been guiding me toward Tuesday all autumn. I clicked the key fob, opened the passenger door, and stopped with one hand on the frame. June's Old Yeller lay on the seat, dry, scented, cover facing up. I had locked it in the storage tray under the rear bench before shift. I knew I had because I remembered turning the key twice and pocketing it with my ring. Now it sat in plain sight with a fresh cedar sprig tucked between pages, stem aligned like a bookmark. Rain flecked the doorsill, but not the book. I climbed in slowly and pulled the door shut against the weather. Boone hopped up, circled once and put his chin on the console, watching me. My fingers shook enough that I had to brace the spine against my thigh to open it. The sprig marked the exact page where Travis says he can hear Old Yeller's yelp after the shot, the page that always made June stop reading and clear her throat before going on for Caleb's sake. In the margin, faint and slanted, was her old pencil note. "Breathe here." I sat there with rain on the roof and that note in front of me, and the kindness in it hit so clean it hurt. Not random placement, not decoration. Whoever had done this had watched, listened, understood what mattered to me, and answered with care precise as a fitted joint. The book wasn't damaged. The pages were dry. The sprig smelled sharp and alive. Boone leaned his weight against my leg. I pressed my palm to his shoulder and laughed once through a tight throat. "All right," I whispered. "I hear you." I looked through the windshield toward the cedar edge. No movement, no shape, just rain silvering the lot and pooling in tire ruts. "Thank you," I said, louder this time, not expecting a reply and not needing one. At home, I didn't put the book back under lock. I set it on the kitchen table, open to that page, and placed the cedar sprig beside June's old mug. Then I split the bundle of dry kindling I'd found tucked in my truck bed that same night, wrapped in waxed bark tight against rain, clean and ready, and built the first fire I'd lit in the farmhouse stove since she died. Boone stretched on the rug with his nose toward the warmth. I sat in the chair by the window and read 3 chapters out loud to an empty room that did not feel empty anymore. I read until the stove settled into a deep orange bed and the windows turned black mirrors. By the end of the 3rd chapter, my voice had gone thin from use and from holding back what kept climbing into my throat. I closed the book and set my palm on the cover, feeling the dented cloth under my hand, the places where June's thumbs had worn it smooth over the years. Boone lifted his head from the rug and watched me the way he used to watch June when she had one of her quiet spells, like he understood silence could be work. I sat there and tried to keep it tidy in my chest. That had been my method since the funeral. Keep it tidy, keep it functional, keep breathing, and do the next chore. But grief had never really gone anywhere. It had just moved into storage like extra furniture in a room I refused to enter. I looked at the cedar sprig on the table, at her mug beside it, and whatever latch I had built finally gave way. I bent forward with my elbows on my knees and cried so hard my ribs hurt. No dignity to it. No measured tears, just months of held-back ache coming out all at once in a kitchen that had heard too much silence. Boone got up, walked over and leaned his weight against my shin. I put my hand on his neck and let him steady me. I spoke out loud because there was no point pretending otherwise anymore. "I miss you," I said to the empty chair across from me. "I miss your voice in this room. I miss being known without explaining myself." The words came rough and fast. "I've been mad at you for leaving and mad at myself for that too. I've been walking around this house like a night watchman in my own life." I laughed once through tears, short and ragged. "You'd tell me to stop being dramatic and eat something green." That one got me again, because I could hear her saying it. I stayed there until crying eased into those long, shaky breaths that leave you wrung out, but clearer. In my head, present tense took over the way it had in the woods. I'm not fixing this tonight. I'm not solving loss like a maintenance ticket. I'm sitting in my kitchen with a dog at my leg and my wife's handwriting in a book, and I'm finally admitting I loved her enough to be broken by her absence. I told myself this couldn't be real for months, that I was overreading weather and woods and random chance because loneliness makes men strange. But the signs kept arriving with care, and care has a shape. It has intention. I knew somehow that I wasn't being mocked by the world. I was being met in it. That thought did not erase pain. It gave it a place to rest. By dawn the next morning, rain had shifted from steady to relentless, the kind that turns ditches into channels, and channels into threats. I called the library from my truck before shift and got Pam at circulation. "You seeing this radar?" she asked before I could speak. "Yeah, backlot's already holding water." "County says more through Tuesday night. Ada asked me to tell you she's coming anyway." I looked through the windshield at water streaming off the barn roof in sheets. "Tell her not to be stubborn," Pam snorted. "You tell her." 3 days passed before the creek-level reports started coming in from road crews, and by then, the Blackwater ravine below the library had gone from loud to mean. I spent early mornings setting sandbags along the footbridge approach with 2 teenagers from Public Works who joked through the cold because they were still young enough to think rain was an inconvenience instead of history repeating. The bridge was old timber with one concrete abutment and one side built up over packed stone. If that stone washed out, Ada's little cedar reading patch would be cut off until spring. On Monday evening, I called Caleb while I was stripping off wet gloves in the boiler room. "You sound tired," he said. "I am. Creek's trying to take our bridge." There was a pause, then, "You need me to drive down?" "No, not yet." Another pause, longer. "Dad, I keep waiting for you to ask for anything." I leaned against the cinder block wall and watched steam tick off a pipe seam. "Then here's something. Stay on the line while I walk back out there." He did. I took him with me by phone from basement stairs to loading dock to the cedar edge, where water thudded below in the dark. I described the sandbag line, the signpost still standing straight, the way Boone stood braced but calm, tail low and steady. Caleb didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "I don't know what's going on out there, but you sound more like yourself than you have in months." I swallowed and said, "Yeah." That was the whole truth I had. Tuesday arrived under a low sky and needle rain. By noon, Ada called in sick for the first time since I'd known her. "Bronchitis," Pam said. "Doctor's orders, bed and tea and no heroics." I stood with the phone in my hand and stared at the children's desk while kids' posters curled at the corners from humidity. "She'll hate missing," I said. "She already does," Pam answered. She asked if someone could set her chair out anyway. Said the Woods might be expecting Chapter 10. I carried the folding chair out at dusk, one hand on the book crate under tarp, the other holding my collar against the rain. Boone followed close. The clearing looked smaller without Ada in it, like a room after furniture is moved. Wind pushed across the lot hard enough to make the chain link hum, and water had started finger-curling over the low part of the path in quick brown ribbons. I set her chair where it always went and sat down with Old Yeller in my lap. "All right," I said to no one visible. "Attendance is bad tonight." Humour showed up even then, stubborn and dry. "You're getting the substitute reader and he does poor character voices." Boone huffed like he approved or pitied me. Hard to tell. I started reading. First page rough, second page better. By the third, something familiar settled around the clearing. The gusts still hit my shoulders, hit the fence, hit the tarps behind me, but the band of cedar directly ahead stilled. Branch tips quieting one by one until the reading patch held that same held breath calm I'd felt before. I kept going, voice wavering every few lines from cold and from the weight of sitting in Ada's place, with rain running off my cap brim. Halfway through the chapter, a surge came down from upstream and spread over the path in a quick sheet. My canvas satchel, which I had set by the chair leg with Ada's notes and my notebook inside, floated, tipped, and started sliding toward the ravine edge with the current. I stood too fast, boots skidding in mud, and reached for it. A dark shape moved from the left tree line with measured speed, large enough to blot 2 cedar trunks at once. He crossed the flooded strip in 3 deliberate steps, water breaking around his shins, and bent without splash or scramble. One huge hand caught the satchel by the strap cleanly, lifted it clear, and carried it back to me. He did not crowd me. He stopped an arm's length beyond Boone, lowered the bag beside my boot, and released the strap as gently as if it were glass. I couldn't speak for a second. Boone stood and leaned against my leg, calm as hearthstone, eyes on the figure with open attention. Rain ticked on leaves. My breath sounded loud in my own ears. "Thank you," I said, and my voice cracked in the middle. He held still. Up close, the scale was almost hard to process. His shoulders were broad as a shed door, fur dark with rain, hands built for force but moving with startling control. His eyes found mine, amber brown in the dim light, steady and unhurried, no demand in them, no warning, just recognition. I knelt and opened the satchel with shaking fingers, expecting soaked paper. Inside, everything was dry. On top lay June's marked copy of Charlotte's Web, wrapped in waxed bark against the weather, and beside it a tight bundle of kindling, also bark-wrapped, clean and ready. Not random, chosen. Deliberate, in exactly the way the cedar sprig had been deliberate. I pressed my hand over my mouth and felt tears start again, sudden and deep. "I know," I whispered, words tumbling out before I could dress them up. I know. I cried there in the rain with Boone pressed to my thigh and that book in my hands. Years of trying to be unbreakable, finally giving way to something stronger than control. The old shame I'd carried about grief, about needing, about being a grown man undone by memory, loosened and drained out of me with the water running past my boots. He stayed where he was, a few paces off, watchful and patient, as if this too was part of the work. When my breathing steadied, I looked up. He tipped his head once, small and clear. Then he stepped back toward the cedars, placing each foot with care around exposed roots and fern clusters, avoiding the chair, avoiding the books, leaving no damage where he passed. At the tree line he paused, one heartbeat, turned slightly as if to check that I was upright, then continued into shadow. No display, no noise, no rush. The woods took him back the same way they had always opened for him. Quietly. The still band released a few moments later. Branches resumed their movement. Rain hissed through needles. Down in the ravine, water ran fast through the reopened channel instead of piling against the bridge abutment. By full dark, the surge had already dropped an inch against the marked stone. I sat back in Ada's chair and finished the chapter aloud, voice raw but steady now, Boone settling at my boots again. When I closed the book, I set one hand on the armrest and one on the satchel, feeling both solid under my palms. In the mud beside the chair, a wide print held rainwater like a small, dark mirror. I did not measure it. I did not bag it. I just looked at it until the surface quivered with droplets and then went smooth again. The rain kept falling while I sat there, but it had lost its bite. I wiped my face on my sleeve, zipped the satchel, and stood slow so my knee didn't lock. Boone rose with me. I gave the clearing one last look. Chair, crate, fern line, the print holding water beside my boot, and then I carried Ada's chair and the tarp-covered books back toward the rear door in 2 trips. Each time I crossed the lot, wind pushed at my jacket and then eased once I stepped past the cedar edge, like that narrow strip had decided it was done, guarding me for the night. Inside, the library smelled of wet wool rugs and radiator heat. I toweled Boone off with an old circulation desk blanket, clocked out late, and called Ada from the staff phone while I still had mud on my cuffs. She answered on the fourth ring, voice gravelly from bronchitis. "Tell me you read." "I read," I said. "Chapter all the way through." A long breath came through the line, relieved and amused together. "Good. I knew the trees would behave for a substitute." I looked through the back window at rain streaks catching security light. Bridge held for now. Water's running cleaner. Somebody cleared upstream log jams before the surge hit. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "And you're all right?" I held the phone tighter. "Yeah, I am. Better than all right, I think. Tired, wet, and better." "Then go home and warm up," she said. "Bring me the full account when I'm upright again. No editing." The next morning, County Public Works sent the same two boys from sandbag duty and their supervisor, Mitch Carver, to inspect the footbridge abutment. By then, the sky had lifted from pewter to low white, and the ravine had dropped another 3 inches against the marker rock. We stood at the bank in rubber boots while water shoved branches through the channel. Mitch squinted at the upstream side and scratched his beard. "Who braced this?" "Wasn't county crew," I said. He climbed down for a closer look and ran his glove over the stone packing. Flat rocks were interlocked with deadfall, wedged at angles that spread pressure instead of catching it. It was rough material set with real intelligence. "Whoever did it understood current," he said. "Bought us enough time to keep the approach from sloughing out." One of the boys pointed at the reopened flow line. "Looks like somebody rolled half that jam out by hand." "Would have taken a machine," the other said. Mitch shook his head. "No tire marks, no drag chains." He looked at me. "You see anyone out here overnight?" I watched brown water fold past the bracing and chose plain truth without details he couldn't use. "I saw help. That's what I can say." He gave me a long, measuring look, the kind men give when they decide whether to push. He didn't push. "Well, tell your help I owe him coffee," he said, and slapped my shoulder before heading back up the bank. By the first week of November, Ada was back in her chair with a wool blanket over her knees and a cough drop tucked in her cheek. I brought her tea and set Charlotte's Web on top of the crate so she could see it. Her eyes went to the waxed bark wrap first, then to me. "You want the unedited version?" I asked. I asked for it. So I told her all of it behind the library before reading hour, from the satchel sliding in floodwater to the careful hand lifting it by one strap, from Boone leaning calm against my leg, to June's book lying dry where rain had no right to spare it. I told her about crying in the clearing and saying, "I know," like the words had been waiting months for a mouth. Ada listened with both hands around her thermos cup. When I finished, she looked toward the cedars and nodded once. "I never saw him that close," she said. "Only glimpses and gifts. Stones, berries, kindling. Once a line of wildflowers set on the crate when the first graders were all out with flu. But I always felt watched over, not watched. You never told me." "You weren't ready to hear it," she said, not unkind. "You were still trying to survive by narrowing the world." That landed clean because it was true. I sat on the milk crate and stared at my boots for a second. "I kept a lot of notes," I said. "Wind readings, track sizes, map sketches, berries in a freezer bag. Like I could prove this into being acceptable." She smiled a little. "Did it help?" "It got me through disbelief." I looked up at her. "But no report is going to carry what happened." "Then keep what matters and let the rest be notes." That afternoon I did exactly that. In the boiler room office, I opened June's canning notebook and sorted every scrap I had collected. The receipt paper map got taped to the inside cover. Wind gauge numbers stayed on their dated pages because they were part of the record. I wrote one line beside them: pattern observed, mechanism unknown. The freezer bag bark from the BlackBerry fan had dried to a brittle curl. I wrapped it in wax paper and tucked it in an envelope marked "Found Gift, Tuesday." The berries themselves had long since fed birds, and I wrote that down too because evidence should be honest even when it disappears. The mud print measurements stayed in the notebook. The print itself had washed out by dawn after that storm night, and I noted that plainly. Impression lost to rain. No cast taken by choice. Nothing abandoned by accident. Everything accounted for. Late that same evening, I called Caleb while I sat at the kitchen table with Charlotte's Web open between us in memory. He answered from his car on break. "You breathing heavy?" he asked. "Just climbed porch steps with firewood," I said. "Listen, I want you down here Tuesday before Thanksgiving if you can manage it." He was quiet, then careful. "That invitation comes with a catch." "Yeah," I said. "Bring your reading voice." He gave a soft laugh that turned rough at the edge. "I can do that." 3 days passed before he texted his route and arrival time, and I printed it like an old man because I didn't trust my phone battery in cold weather. He rolled in just after noon in a dented blue pickup, beard fuller than I remembered, eyes still his mother's. We did the awkward father-son half-hug in the yard, while Boone circled both of us and sneezed from excitement. Inside, Caleb saw June's coat still by the mudroom door and touched the sleeve without comment. At supper, he looked at the crossed river stones I had set on the table corner and asked, "These new?" "From behind the library," I said. He studied me, waiting for either a joke or retreat. I gave him neither. "I've got a story for you," I said. "Long one. You can decide what you believe at the end." We stayed up past midnight with the stove ticking and Boone snoring on the rug, while I told it from the first still Tuesday to the flood night. Caleb asked practical questions, all the right ones. Distance, weather, tracks, witnesses, timing. I answered every one. When I got to the part where I broke down in Ada's chair, he looked down at his mug and said, "I hate that I wasn't here for that." "You're here now," I said. He nodded, eyes wet, and that was enough. Winter ran hard after that, but Blackwater never took the bridge. County reinforced the approach in December, using Mitch's notes and the existing stone brace as the template. He told me, half grinning, "We copied your mystery carpenter." I just nodded and handed him a thermos. On Tuesdays, Ada read first chapter and I read second. Some weeks there were 4 kids on blankets, some weeks 10, depending on weather and rides. By the second week of March, the school district had restored one rural late bus, and the little crowd thickened again with muddy boots and mismatched mittens. Boone took up his post near the chair and accepted absent-minded petting, like old royalty. One mild Tuesday in April, sunlight came thin and gold through new leaves, and the ravine sounded like ordinary spring water instead of threat. Ada finished chapter 1 of Charlotte's Web, closed the book in my hands, and whispered, "Your turn, Mr. Murray." Kids giggled at that title because they knew me as the boiler guy and candy jar enforcer. I opened to chapter 2 and read. My voice carried steady into the cedars. Halfway through, a pair of deer stepped out at the far edge of the trees and grazed without hurry. None of the children noticed at first. Then one little boy in a red cap whispered, "Look," and pointed. The deer kept feeding, ears flicking, calm as if this had always been their hour too. At the end of chapter, wind moved through the maples, but the cedar strip behind us held its quiet for one lingering breath before joining the rest of the day. I closed the book and felt that familiar loosening in my chest. Not grief leaving exactly, but grief making room for wonder, without losing dignity. After the kids went home and Ada headed inside with the crate, I stayed a minute by the chair. On the fern mat where the first stone X had appeared months ago, sat a new pair of crossed river stones, one with a white stripe, one smooth and dark. I picked them up and weighed them in my palm. Cool, solid, real. I looked toward the trees and nodded once. At home that night, I moved June's coat from the mudroom hook to the cedar chest in our bedroom, folded with care, not hidden, not abandoned. I set the crossed stones on my desk beside the taped map and the canning notebook. Then I called Caleb and read him the first 2 pages of the next Tuesday chapter, while he listened on speaker from his apartment kitchen, laughing at my bad character voices exactly where he used to laugh at 10 years old. I still fixed boilers. I still trusted wrenches and weather reports and things a man can measure. But every Tuesday, when I carried a chair to the cedar edge and opened a book, I carried something else too. The memory of amber-brown eyes that asked for nothing, a hand large enough to move logs yet gentle with paper and strap, and the steady fact that kindness had found me when I had gone numb to it. That was the part I kept. That was the part that healed.